"This is impossible." Dr. Robert Chen's voice echoed through Nashville Children's Hospital as he stared at the brain scans in his trembling hands. On the monitors, 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell's neural activity was unlike anything medical science had ever documented. The blind girl was playing a piano melody that shouldn't exist anywhere in the world. "Call Graceland immediately," Chen shouted to his nurse. "She's accessing Elvis Presley's private compositions." Songs that were never recorded, never written down, never heard by anyone. But Sarah had been born 2 years after Elvis died, thousands of miles from Memphis. How could she know melodies that existed only in the king's mind? 3 hours later, when Priscilla Presley heard the recordings over the phone, she broke down crying. That's the lullaby Elvis hummed to Lisa Marie. No one else knew that song. It was March 15, 1989, and Dr. Robert Chen had been studying the human brain for over 20 years. He was Nashville Children's Hospital's chief neurologist, a man who had seen every possible variation of brain function, cognitive development, and neurological anomalies. He had published over 40 research papers, spoken at international conferences, and built his reputation on his ability to explain the seemingly inexplicable. But what he witnessed that morning would challenge everything he thought he knew about memory, consciousness, and the very nature of human perception. Dr. Chen had earned his medical degree from Johns Hopkins University and completed his neurology residency at Massachusetts General Hospital. He had chosen to work with children because he believed that young brains held the key to understanding human consciousness in its purest form. Throughout his career, he had maintained a strictly scientific approach to his work, dismissing anything that couldn't be measured, quantified, and replicated in controlled conditions. Sarah Mitchell was born on August 17, 1977, exactly 2 years and 1 day after Elvis Presley passed away at Graceland. She came into the world completely blind due to a rare genetic condition called Leber congenital amaurosis, which destroyed the light-sensitive cells in her retinas before birth. From her first breath, Sarah had never seen light, never observed facial expressions, never watched someone play an instrument. The condition affected fewer than 1 in 80,000 children, making Sarah's case rare even among rare diseases. The Mitchell family lived in Clarksville, Tennessee, a small town about 50 miles northwest of Nashville. It was a community where everyone knew everyone else, where church attendance was expected, and where unusual circumstances were often met with suspicion rather than support. When Sarah was born blind, some community members whispered that it was divine punishment for some unknown sin, while others simply pitied the family for their misfortune. Despite her blindness, Sarah had always been drawn to music with an intensity that amazed her parents. As a toddler, she would stop crying instantly when music played, tilting her head as if she was analyzing every note and rhythm. By age 2, she was humming along to songs on the radio with perfect pitch, a skill that her parents assumed was simply a natural adaptation to her blindness. By age 4, she was humming complex melodies that her parents had never heard before, creating intricate harmonies that seemed far beyond her years. David Mitchell was a quiet, hard-working man who had never finished high school but possessed an innate understanding of mechanical systems that made him invaluable at the local auto repair shop where he worked. He was a man of few words, but his love for his daughter was evident in the way he patiently answered her endless questions about the world she couldn't see. David would spend hours describing colors, textures, and visual phenomena to Sarah, helping her build a mental picture of a world she would never directly experience. Mary Mitchell was a second-grade teacher at Clarksville Elementary School, a woman who understood the power of education to transform lives. She had grown up in poverty herself and was determined that Sarah's blindness would not limit her daughter's opportunities. Mary read to Sarah for hours every day, exposing her to literature, poetry, and stories that expanded her daughter's understanding of the world beyond their small town. Sarah's parents, David and Mary Mitchell, were simple people living in a small town outside Nashville. David worked at a local auto repair shop, and Mary taught elementary school. They weren't musicians, didn't own many records, and couldn't afford piano lessons for their daughter. The Mitchell household contained only a small radio and a few cassette tapes of country music and gospel songs that Mary used in her classroom. Yet Sarah's musical abilities continued to develop in ways that defied explanation. When Sarah was 3 years old, she began demonstrating an ability that puzzled her parents and her pediatrician. She could identify and reproduce musical intervals with perfect accuracy, distinguishing between major and minor chords, and even recognizing the difference between various musical keys. Dr. Patricia Williams, Sarah's pediatrician, had never encountered such sophisticated musical understanding in a child so young. It's not uncommon for blind children to develop enhanced auditory abilities, Dr. Williams explained to Sarah's parents during a routine checkup. But Sarah's musical comprehension goes far beyond typical adaptation. She seems to understand music theory at a level that usually requires years of formal training. When Sarah was 7 years old, she heard a piano for the first time at her school's music program. The moment her fingers touched the keys, something extraordinary happened. Without any instruction, without ever having seen how a piano was played, Sarah began creating melodies that left her teachers speechless. It wasn't just that she could play, it was that she seemed to understand music at a level that typically took years of training to achieve. Mrs. Janet Henderson, Clarksville Elementary's music teacher, had been working with children for over 15 years. She had seen talented students before, children with natural rhythm or good pitch, but Sarah's abilities were unlike anything in her experience. The melodies Sarah created were sophisticated compositions with complex harmonic structures, emotional depth, and stylistic elements that seemed to draw from decades of musical knowledge. "I've never heard a child play music like this," Mrs. Henderson confided to Mary Mitchell after Sarah's first piano session. "These aren't simple childhood songs. These are sophisticated compositions that show an understanding of musical theory that I'm still learning myself. Where is she getting this knowledge?" The Mitchell family's financial situation made private music lessons impossible. But Sarah's music teacher, Mrs. Henderson, recognized the child's exceptional gift. She arranged for Sarah to have access to the school piano after hours, staying late to supervise as Sarah explored the instrument with an intensity that was both beautiful and unsettling. These after-school sessions became the highlight of Sarah's week, and Mrs. Henderson found herself looking forward to them with a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. What disturbed Mrs. Henderson wasn't Sarah's talent, it was the songs she played. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, complex, and completely unfamiliar. They possessed an emotional maturity that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old to understand, much less express through music. Some songs were joyful and uplifting, others were tinged with a sadness that brought tears to Mrs. Henderson's eyes. All of them showed a level of musical sophistication that defied explanation. When Mrs. Henderson asked Sarah where she had learned these songs, the blind girl would simply say, "I hear them in my head. Someone is always singing to me." When pressed for more details, Sarah would explain that the voice belonged to a man who sang to her when she was alone, especially at night when she was trying to fall asleep. "He has a deep voice and a kind heart," Sarah would say. "He teaches me new songs all the time." Mrs. Henderson documented Sarah's musical development, recording hours of the child's performances on a small cassette recorder that she purchased with her own money. She labeled each tape with the date and a brief description of the music Sarah had played, creating an archive that would later become crucial evidence of Sarah's extraordinary abilities. The melodies Sarah created were sophisticated compositions that seemed to come from decades of musical experience, not the mind of a 7-year-old child. But what troubled Mrs. Henderson most was that many of the songs had a distinctly Elvis-like quality, a musical style that Sarah had never been exposed to in her sheltered small-town life. The harmonies, the rhythm patterns, and even the emotional inflections reminded Mrs. Henderson of Elvis Presley's music, particularly his gospel-influenced compositions. This seemed impossible, as the Mitchell family wasn't Elvis fans, and Sarah had never been exposed to his music in any significant way. Mrs. Henderson decided to conduct an experiment. She brought several Elvis albums to school and played them during Sarah's practice sessions, watching carefully for the child's reaction. Sarah listened intently to songs like "How Great Thou Art" and "He Touched Me," nodding along as if she recognized the melodies. When the songs ended, Sarah would often sit at the piano and play variations on the themes she had just heard, but her versions were somehow more complex and emotionally nuanced than the originals. "Do you know who sang those songs?" Mrs. Henderson asked after playing several Elvis gospel recordings. Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully before answering, "It sounds like the singing man in my head, but different. Like he was holding back something when he made those recordings. The singing man in my head sings with his whole heart, like he doesn't have to worry about what other people think." As Sarah grew older, her musical abilities became more pronounced and more puzzling. She would often sit at the piano and play songs she claimed to have learned in her dreams. These weren't simple melodies, but complex compositions with intricate chord progressions and emotional depth that seemed impossible for a child to create. Some songs were complete musical pieces with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. Others were fragments, partial melodies that Sarah said the singing man was still working on. David Mitchell began to worry about his daughter's intense focus on music and her claims about hearing voices. He took Sarah to several doctors, including child psychologists, hoping to understand what was happening in his daughter's mind. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a child psychologist in Nashville, conducted extensive interviews with Sarah and administered various psychological tests to assess her mental health and cognitive development. Sarah shows no signs of mental illness or psychological trauma, Dr. Stevens reported to the Mitchell family after completing her evaluation. Her claims about hearing a singing voice could be a form of musical auditory processing that we don't fully understand. Some individuals with extraordinary musical talent report experiencing music as if it comes from an external source, when it's actually their own creative mind working at a subconscious level. Dr. Stevens' explanation provided some comfort to Sarah's parents, but it didn't account for the sophisticated nature of the music Sarah was creating, or the specific stylistic elements that connected her compositions to Elvis Presley's musical legacy. The songs Sarah played went far beyond what could be explained by natural talent or enhanced auditory processing. They seemed to contain musical knowledge that existed outside of Sarah's direct experience. By the time Sarah turned 10, her musical abilities had reached a level that attracted attention beyond her small town. Mrs. Henderson had shared some of her recordings with music teachers in the Nashville area, and word of the blind musical prodigy began to spread. Dr. Michael Harrison, a musicologist at Vanderbilt University, drove to Clarksville to hear Sarah play after Mrs. Henderson sent him several cassette recordings. "I've studied musical development in children for over 20 years, Dr. Harrison told the Mitchell family after listening to Sarah perform. "What your daughter is doing goes beyond anything I've encountered in professional literature. The complexity and emotional sophistication of her compositions suggest musical knowledge that typically takes decades to develop. I'm recommending that Sarah be evaluated by neurological specialists who can study how her brain processes musical information." A local newspaper wrote an article about the blind musical prodigy, which caught the attention of Dr. Robert Chen at Nashville Children's Hospital. Dr. Chen specialized in studying unusual brain function in children, and Sarah's case intrigued him from a neurological perspective. He had seen children with savant syndrome who displayed extraordinary abilities in specific areas, but the emotional depth and stylistic consistency of Sarah's musical creations suggested something more complex than typical savant abilities. Dr. Chen first met Sarah in February 1989, when her parents brought her to the hospital for a comprehensive neurological evaluation. They wanted to understand if Sarah's musical abilities were connected to her blindness, and whether there were any medical explanations for her extraordinary talent. The evaluation included extensive cognitive testing, brain imaging studies, and detailed analysis of Sarah's musical abilities. During the initial examination, Dr. Chen was impressed by Sarah's intelligence and musical knowledge, but he attributed her abilities to the well-documented phenomenon of heightened auditory development in blind individuals. Many blind people develop extraordinary hearing abilities to compensate for their lack of sight, and Dr. Chen assumed Sarah's musical talent was an extreme example of this adaptation. He had seen similar cases where blind children developed perfect pitch, enhanced musical memory, and sophisticated understanding of sound patterns. Sarah's musical abilities are remarkable, but not necessarily supernatural, Dr. Chen explained to her parents after the initial evaluation. The human brain has an incredible capacity for adaptation, especially in children. When one sense is compromised, other senses often develop to an extraordinary degree. Sarah's blindness may have triggered the development of musical abilities that exist in all of us but usually remain dormant. But everything changed on the morning of March 15, 1989, when Dr. Chen decided to conduct a brain scan while Sarah was playing piano. He wanted to study how her brain processed musical information, hoping to understand the neurological basis for her remarkable abilities. What he discovered that morning would haunt him for the rest of his career and force him to question everything he thought he knew about consciousness, memory, and the nature of human potential. Sarah sat at the small piano in the hospital's music therapy room, electrodes attached to her head, while Dr. Chen monitored her brain activity on sophisticated scanning equipment. He asked Sarah to play one of her original compositions, expecting to see the typical patterns of auditory processing and motor coordination. Instead, what Dr. Chen observed was completely unprecedented. Sarah's brain showed activity in regions that shouldn't have been active during piano playing. Her temporal lobe, associated with memory processing, was lighting up as if she was accessing vast stores of musical information. Her auditory cortex was responding as if she was hearing a full orchestra, even though the only sound in the room was her solo piano. But the most shocking discovery was in Sarah's parietal lobe, the brain region associated with spatial awareness and sensory integration. Despite being born blind, Sarah's visual cortex was showing activity patterns that suggested she was somehow seeing the music she was playing. "This is neurologically impossible," Dr. Chen muttered to his research assistant, Dr. Emily Watson. "She's showing brain activity patterns that suggest she's accessing musical memories that aren't hers. It's as if she's connected to an external source of musical information." As Sarah continued playing, the melody became more complex and emotionally charged. Dr. Chen found himself deeply moved by the music, which had a quality that reminded him of something familiar yet impossible to place. The song was hauntingly beautiful, with a gospel-influenced style that seemed to channel decades of musical experience. "Sarah," Dr. Chen said gently, "that's a beautiful song. Where did you learn it?" Sarah's hands never stopped moving across the keys as she answered, "The singing man taught it to me. He says it was for his little girl, but he never got to finish it before he went to heaven." Dr. Chen felt a chill run down his spine. "What singing man, Sarah? Can you tell me more about him?" Sarah tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "He has a deep voice and a kind heart. He says his name is Elvis, and he's been trying to finish his songs for a long time." The words hit Dr. Chen like a physical blow. Elvis. Could Sarah somehow be accessing the musical legacy of Elvis Presley? It seemed impossible, yet the style of music she was playing was undeniably reminiscent of the King's gospel-influenced compositions. "Sarah, can you play another song that the singing man taught you?" Dr. Chen asked, his voice barely steady. Sarah nodded and began a new melody, this one even more complex and emotionally powerful than the first. As she played, Dr. Chen noticed tears streaming down her face, though she seemed unaware of her emotional response. The melody was achingly beautiful, filled with a longing and spiritual depth that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old to understand, much less express. The musical structure showed sophisticated understanding of gospel harmony, chord progressions that were distinctively Elvis-like, and emotional nuances that suggested deep personal experience with loss and redemption. "This one makes him very sad," Sarah explained without stopping her performance. "He says he wrote it for someone he loved very much, but he could never find the right words. He's been looking for the words for a long time, even after he couldn't sing it himself anymore. He's still looking for the words, even now." Dr. Chen's hands were shaking as he watched the brain scans. Sarah's neural activity was unlike anything in medical literature. She was somehow accessing musical information that existed outside her own experience, outside her own memory. The temporal lobe activity suggested she was retrieving memories that weren't hers, while her auditory cortex responded as if she was hearing a full musical arrangement that no one else in the room could detect. Over the next hour, Sarah played 17 different melodies, each one more complex and emotionally sophisticated than the last. Dr. Chen recorded every moment, capturing both the musical performances and the corresponding brain activity. What emerged was a picture of musical knowledge that defied all conventional understanding of memory and learning. Some of the songs were complete compositions with clear structures and emotional arcs. Others were fragments, partial melodies, that Sarah said the singing man was still working on. A few pieces seemed to be variations on familiar gospel themes, but arranged with a sophistication and emotional depth that elevated them far beyond their traditional forms. "Dr. Chen," Sarah said during a brief rest period, "the singing man wants me to tell you something important. He says that scientists spend so much time trying to understand how things work that they forget to understand why things are. Music isn't just sound waves and brain patterns. Music is love made audible, and love doesn't follow the same rules as everything else." The profound nature of Sarah's statement, combined with the sophistication of the musical compositions she was channeling, forced Dr. Chen to confront the possibility that consciousness might exist independently of physical brain function. If Sarah was indeed receiving musical instruction from Elvis Presley's surviving consciousness, it would revolutionize not just neuroscience, but humanity's understanding of life, death, and the nature of existence itself. Dr. Chen began asking Sarah more detailed questions about the source of her musical knowledge. "Sarah," he said during a brief break, "the singing man you hear, does he tell you anything else? About where these songs come from? About why he's sharing them with you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her head tilted as if listening to a distant voice that only she could hear. When she spoke, her words carried a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 12 years. "He says these are the songs he never got to share with the world," Sarah replied. "He had so many melodies in his heart, but he ran out of time. People remember the songs he recorded, but those were just a small part of the music that lived inside him. Now he wants people to hear the rest, so they won't be lost forever." Sarah continued. "He says that when someone loves music as much as he did, the music doesn't die when their body stops working. The music finds new ways to be heard, new voices to carry it forward. He chose me because I don't have other things to distract me from listening. Because I'm blind, I can hear things that other people miss." "Can you play the song that makes him the happiest?" Dr. Chen asked, his voice filled with wonder despite his scientific skepticism. Sarah smiled, the first time Dr. Chen had seen her truly happy during the session. "This one is very special," Sarah said, as she began a new melody. "He says it's a lullaby he used to sing to his little girl when she was scared or couldn't sleep. It was their secret song, just between daddy and daughter. No one else ever heard it, not even his wife. It was something that belonged just to them." The melody that poured from the piano was breathtakingly beautiful, a gentle, loving lullaby with a simplicity that made it even more powerful. Dr. Chen found himself moved to tears by the emotional purity of the music. The song had the intimate quality of something deeply personal, a musical expression of paternal love that felt too private to be witnessed by strangers. "He wants his little girl to know that Daddy is still singing to her," Sarah said softly as she continued playing, her own tears falling freely now. Even though she can't see him anymore, even though she's grown up now, the music connects their hearts forever. Love doesn't end when someone goes to heaven. It just finds new ways to be expressed. As the session ended, Dr. Chen faced an impossible decision. How could he report findings that challenged the fundamental principles of neuroscience? How could he explain brain activity patterns that suggested consciousness could exist independently of physical death? How could he document Sarah's claims about receiving musical instruction from Elvis Presley without destroying his professional reputation and possibly ending his career? "Dr. Chen," Sarah said as her parents prepared to take her home, "the singing man wants you to know that music never dies. It lives forever in the hearts of people who truly understand its power. He says you have an important choice to make. You can choose to be afraid of what you don't understand, or you can choose to help the music find its way to the people who need to hear it." That evening, Dr. Chen sat in his office, staring at the brain scans and listening to the recordings of Sarah's performance. The medical evidence was undeniable. Sarah was accessing musical information through means that medical science couldn't explain. Her brain activity suggested she was somehow connected to an external source of musical knowledge that existed independently of her own experience and memory. Dr. Chen made a decision that would change his life forever. He called Graceland. "I need to speak with Priscilla Presley," he told the receptionist. "I have recordings of musical compositions that she needs to hear. They may be Elvis's lost songs." The receptionist was skeptical, but something in Dr. Chen's voice convinced her to pass along the message. 3 hours later, Dr. Chen's phone rang. "This is Priscilla Presley," the voice said. "I understand you have recordings you want me to hear." Dr. Chen's hands were shaking as he explained Sarah's case and played the recording of the lullaby over the phone. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then, Dr. Chen heard soft crying on the other end of the line. "My God," Priscilla whispered. "That's the lullaby Elvis used to sing to Lisa Marie. He made it up just for her when she was a baby. No one else ever heard that song. How is this possible?" Dr. Chen's voice was barely audible as he replied, "I wish I could explain it, Mrs. Presley. But I believe your husband is still creating music, and somehow a blind little girl in Nashville is his instrument." What followed was a series of conversations between Dr. Chen, Priscilla Presley, and several musicologists who specialized in Elvis's work. The recordings of Sarah's performances were analyzed by experts who confirmed that the musical style was authentically Elvis-like, incorporating elements of his signature sound that were too sophisticated for a 12-year-old to have developed independently. More importantly, several of the melodies Sarah played matched descriptions of songs that Elvis had been working on before his death. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and musical collaborator, listened to the recordings and confirmed that some of the melodies were indeed compositions that Elvis had hummed privately but never completed. "It's like hearing Elvis's lost musical diary," Charlie told Dr. Chen during a phone conversation. "These are the songs that lived in his heart but never made it to the recording studio. How Sarah could know them is beyond my understanding, but I recognize Elvis's musical voice in every note." News of Sarah's extraordinary abilities began to spread within the medical and musical communities. Dr. Chen published a carefully worded research paper describing Sarah's neurological patterns without making claims about their supernatural origin. The paper attracted attention from researchers around the world who were studying the relationship between consciousness and musical ability. Sarah's life changed dramatically as word of her gift spread. Musicians, researchers, and Elvis fans began making pilgrimages to Nashville to hear the blind girl who seemed to channel the king's lost compositions. Sarah's parents, overwhelmed by the attention, worked with Dr. Chen to manage their daughter's exposure while protecting her childhood. Through it all, Sarah remained remarkably grounded and normal for a child her age. She attended school, played with friends, and enjoyed typical childhood activities. But every day she spent time at the piano, serving as a conduit for musical compositions that brought Elvis's unfinished creative work to the world. "The singing man is very happy now," Sarah told Dr. Chen during one of their regular sessions. "He says people are finally hearing the songs he carried in his heart. Music was his way of sharing love with the world, and now that love can continue through me." In 1995, when Sarah was 18, she was invited to perform at Graceland for a special concert celebrating Elvis's musical legacy. Priscilla Presley introduced her as the young woman who helped us discover that Elvis's music lives forever in the hearts of those who truly understand its power. Sarah's performance that night included several of the compositions she had learned from the voice in her mind, including the lullaby that had first convinced Priscilla of the connection. As Sarah played, many audience members reported feeling an emotional connection that went beyond typical musical performance. Today, Sarah Mitchell-Williams lives quietly in Nashville with her husband and 2 children. She continues to compose and perform music, always guided by the voice that has been her constant companion since childhood. She teaches piano to visually impaired children, sharing not just musical technique, but the deeper truth that music can connect souls across any barrier. Dr. Chen, now retired, still corresponds with Sarah and continues to study the relationship between consciousness and musical ability. His research into Sarah's case helped establish new understanding of how the human brain processes musical information and opened new avenues of inquiry into the nature of extraordinary talent. The recordings of Sarah's performances are now part of the Graceland archives, preserved as examples of Elvis's lost musical legacy. Musicologists continue to study these compositions, finding in them the same emotional depth and stylistic sophistication that characterized Elvis's greatest work. Sarah's story reminds us that the bonds created through music transcend physical existence. It shows us that love, creativity, and artistic expression are forces too powerful to be contained by death. Most importantly, it demonstrates that sometimes the most profound connections happen not through sight or speech, but through the universal language of music. The medical mystery of how Sarah acquired her extraordinary musical knowledge may never be fully solved. But perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps the real message of Sarah's story is that love finds a way to express itself, that creativity cannot be silenced, and that the music we carry in our hearts never truly dies. In a world that often seems divided by differences we can see, Sarah's story reminds us of the invisible connections that bind all human hearts together. Through the universal language of music, a blind child from rural Tennessee became the instrument through which the king of rock and roll's unfinished symphonies found their voice. The singing man that Sarah hears may remain a mystery to medical science, but his message is clear. Music is love made audible, and love never dies. It simply finds new voices to carry it forward, ensuring that the melodies of the heart play on forever.